Welcome to Draw Process, where I draw comic book pages and share the methods and approach to completing those pages, as well as process about my development in becoming the practice of my art. I'm on page 48 of episode 2 of my comic book, First Sun and Sword. Okay. Lots of drawing of environments of perspective in this episode, so I'm going to try to comment on that. It'll end up being 4 panels. The first one being an establishing shot of the alley of the city that Farah and Sun and Sword are traveling in, and then it will move closer to them, but at a distance where we can see all of them and the alley that they're in, and what it feels like there. And then we'll move even closer and see our characters, and then see their backs as they're continuing down the path. And there's going to be a changing of perspective in a way, a changing of attention. At first, our attention is on them and in this alley environment, but we see that there are men on the roof watching them. And by the last panel, we're seeing the back of our characters as they go down the alley, the sense that we're kind of taking the perspective of their pursuers. We're seeing them being pursued, being watched. So building of tension in that. In this first panel, I went with a high but not too high vanishing point, horizon line, so that we can see a nice lay of the land. I want to get the camera up above the buildings so that you can see. In order to see down the alleyway, which is narrow, it'll have to be rather central. It'll have to align with the vanishing point where you can see straight up the alley like it's a river. And so that's what I'm constructing there. In the next panel, we have a low horizon. It's also nice to just mix up your horizon and your vanishing point. But now the camera's lower and we see the buildings on either side kind of entrapping our characters. They seem kind of small in comparison. And we see a lot of vagrant people along the sides of the alley. Now an up angle. I decided to go with an up angle so that we would see up under Farah's hat, so that to make sure that the reader knows this is Farah and Sun, because they're dressed differently. They're wearing these grass capes to hide their identities, and there's straw in the cart, and Sword is hiding in the cart underneath it. And so you can see a hint of that here at the bottom of the panel. Looking up at her, Sun just barely in view on the side of her there. And we can see up to the roof of the buildings, up to the sky, and you're going to see men up there looking down at her. And now, yes, it's behind them, and it's kind of from an up-high view. Seeing the perspective of the pursuers. Make sure it really drives home, this. Okay. I'm working out, the perspective, the vanishing point's very low. This is 2-point perspective because things are kind of growing towards the camera as they come up. So you'll notice the buildings are kind of spreading out as they come up. And then there's a vanishing point far up that things are going towards. Okay, as I work out the buildings, I'm looking for groupings of similar buildings, but with some variety. Gaps at times to create negative space. Let the eye rest. But I wanted the alley to feel tight and entrapped. Like they can't just turn a corner easily. There's not a lot of places to go. to continue with this straight line of buildings, there is a giant old wall of blocks that is broken down in the middle. And that's what I've drawn there, stretching back. And then we have one of these large column buildings. I don't know if they're like a granary, like a storage or what, but you see these through the city. There's one of those there, and it's got tarps hanging, coverings hanging around it. So that's to help break up the shape too. Instead, if all we see is rectangular roofs, it can get kind of boring. So I'm breaking it up. Just what feels like good variety feels more attractive. I am not worrying about making sure the buildings that I drew in the first panel are the same as these buildings here. I'm trying to go for the same feel, the same, height roughly. 3 stories, tiny stories. This is not like high-end housing or anything. I want to make it feel kind of dirty and rough, but also make it simple to draw. So, some of those things like rotted wood and broken and cracked, foundations and whatnot, a lot of that stuff is harder to draw because, it takes more detail and it takes more, it's harder too. So I'm trying not to do much of that to indicate it. But we have a stream of sewage running down the middle of this alley, and you got people on either side, and you got some fabric hanging, open windows. You get the feel of, and the fact that the buildings are small and the roofs or the ceilings are low on each floor. It gives you the feel. And lining up the people, they also go away to the vanishing point. So they're just kind of getting smaller as they move up this panel. And I'm just putting them in the slightly different poses. The idea here for the story is whatever you want it to be, but it implies vagrants, it implies suffering homeless people, war veterans, drug users, all kinds of things could be implied here. And I like the thought of drug users being something, because it will help fit in with the mystic side, some other aspects of this story that I'm telling. And here we have the borders. I've set these up where the panel on the right, the second panel, is at the quarter mark. And the bottom 2 panels, it's divided in half. So everything is on a nice, even unit. Yeah. As far as shadows, this entire alleyway is in shadow. The sun is not going to be like directly overhead, so everything is in the cast shadow of one of these buildings, and yet it's being lit. Right, it's not completely dark. So you have lighting from secondary sources. So now that secondary lighting source becomes the primary lighting source. While I'm drawing things in this environment, in this space. So I'm going with just whatever, and in a way I'm just going with whatever shadow looks good. There's lighting from overhead, there's lighting from ahead of them for some reason, because I wanted to cast those shadows behind them somewhat. But that made more sense than from the side, because there's literally buildings on the side of them. So unless they're not in the cast shadow, there would be no light. There wouldn't be like a secondary light reflecting off of those buildings next to them. It's coming from the atmosphere. So it doesn't hurt to have knowledge on those things and study those things, but at the same time, I tend to go by feel. Like, you just know what feels like how it should look. And one thing that can help you with that is painting or penciling loosely. Because when you pencil, you can tend to get overly attentive to the line, the edge of things, instead of the value and shades of things. Instead of working from loose and abstract to refined, you tend to immediately try to lay down refined lines. And so that's one of the reasons it can be good to use a blue pencil or a red pencil under your pencils, because sometimes that gets your brain to think in terms of loose and building almost in a painterly fashion, starting with abstract and loose and values and refining it down and then applying your pencils. So if you approach things that way, then you get a feel for how things look and work, and then you can draw from reality, draw environments from photographs, or especially in person. From movies, I love doing that. Taking a movie I like and pausing it, interesting frames, and quickly sketch out the light and shadow and forms. And so you'll see here that I'm, there's a sort of a layering and a further refining of the loose things I laid down, just like I was saying. So I'm coming back with a heavier pencil, a darker pencil, so that I don't just press harder, because that'll tear up your paper and get you nowhere. But I come back in, and now I'm laying down more of a final edge to things and choosing what spots need more detail. Where do I want to add, bricks of the street with the flowing water? Where do I want to get closer to a final line? And even so, it's not final. I'm still going to come in with the inks and make a final choice. And I said it before last time, but I want to get where I can ink off of these looser pencils and just trust that I'm going to make the right choices with the inks, because it will save time. Because as you'll see, when I pencil this, I rarely have to get out my eraser. I mostly just, whatever I put down works. So if I don't have to erase the pencils, then why don't I just use ink? And even the few times I have to, I could use whiteout if I had to. So I want to move that direction. It'll be faster. And it'll be less redundant. It'll be more fun and engaging. In this case, there is quite a bit of an erasing. I just noticed while I'm talking about that, but this is a pretty complicated shot. Now, there's an interesting thing here around the amount of detail you put in. So if you use a heavy line weight, I use a rather heavy line weight. But if you do that, then it becomes harder to make smaller details, because you can't have as much depth either, because that weight, that heavier weight, you're stuck with it. You can't go lighter. You can't go thinner. So one thing you can do is start to break your line up, like let it not be complete lines, but open. Maybe just like part of the top of a building and part of a side line, vertical line, to indicate there's a building off in the distance. but not fully enclosing it and fully detailing it out. And also the amount of texture you add. Like if you're adding extra little details onto the building when it's in the foreground versus when it's far away, it's just a simple box. So this simplifying of what you're drawing can help you compensate for having a heavy line that's too heavy for that layer, for that further distance. In the past, I would compose my pages if I had like a shot like this I needed to do. I would compose it more carefully, and there would be very little detail. And that doesn't communicate as much information either. If you communicate too much information, like that can also be overwhelming, I guess you could say. Of course, that depends on, the quality of what you're showing. If all the line weights are the same, then it could also feel very flat and very, very busy. And that's not the same thing as high levels of detail. You can have high detail and high clarity at the same time. But nonetheless, more detail, more time to digest, the details, but more clear description of things. If this was a written book, there would be several paragraphs describing the scene when you add more details in your drawing, versus one sentence. And in the past, my style was more like one sentence, and it's moving towards greater detail, but not a ton. So I'm trying to find that sweet spot where I can draw whatever my mind's eye sees. I will draw it. I will draw it quickly without using a ruler, because I like to just freehand my perspective most of the time. Just kind of freely draw whatever my mind wants to create, whatever I want to see in my mind. And use line weight and other things like that to make it readable. It's not that simple, because it's not like, I should say, it's not like I had a picture in my mind of exactly what the city needed to look like. It's a mix. It's from the interaction with certain processes in play behind the scenes in my mind, certain processes playing out on the paper, and my imagination. It's the process, but the interaction between those that leads to the final image. So I'm not someone who visualizes the entire scene in my mind and then just draws it. I figure out a very rough image in my mind. We should have a high vanishing point. We should just see it sprawled out in this way. I need to see, and then I know that the alley needs to be in the middle. So that informs, okay, there has to be an alley here. Okay, and the buildings have to be close together, so she can't just escape at any spot. So I'm just I guess I'll make them all rectangles and just tightly packed, because that would make sense. And then off to the side, I'm going to need some different shapes. So let's mix up the roofs and the shapes and leave some open space. Let's do some other things on the right. And in that sense, it also creates, this alley becomes, it's grouped in your mind, because everything in the alley has this consistent grid-like fashion. The things on the left and right are different than it. So these are like, I'm guided by this. This would read. This would be clear. This would look good. So I'm guided by design principles, drawing processes, including laying out a bit of a perspective grid. Lots of things. You'll see when I'm inking, I go back over things I already inked, and I see where I can add extra weight, extra darkness, and extra texture and details. I need to look over the image and go back and add. I am recently trying to do that without getting out a brush without using a brush. because again, that's another step in the process. I am interested in speed, and just taking the time to get out another tool is less efficient. And it is also, it changes the result, because now you're blending processes together. So I'm going to focus on this one kind of process, of the pen and ink, the nib. The lighting is tricky here, or where to add value. Technically, the left side of all of these buildings they're in shadow. The sun is coming slightly from the right, the upper right side of this panel. But I cannot use lines, hatching lines, to put everything in shadow that's on that, because that runs into the problem of clarity. There's the cast shadows, and then there's the things that are in shadow, meaning lit by secondary sources. And if you use the same kind of hatching lines for both kinds of shadows, then you are getting like less clear. It starts to look flat. You take away the depth. It depends on the style, but when it comes to pen and ink hatching, you do want to approach those differently. So trying to add weight with these lines, as well as depth and shadow, and somewhat realistically. And here's an example of the broken lines in the background. There's just a little zigzag and a few little dashes up in the background to indicate that there's more city back there. Now it's up pretty high, so there must be a hill over there or some very tall buildings, but I wanted to put something there. Keep it in a world. You'll see I'm coming back again and adding even more weight where I can. Because for me, it still looks a little flat. The far away, camera at this angle, this view, is gonna flatten things anyways, because it kind of is flat. You zoom out far enough, it's just a flat map. So that can make it challenging. Versus the second panel, it's going to be easier to give depth to that composition. Here I am applying shadow, mostly based on creating depth and weight to things. The side of these boards is going to be, basically look like it's in shadow. The inside of the building. And we get a good view of the men that are up above. The being able to ink by feel is something that you'll get better and better at over time. I'm still not that good at it, but I'm going to get better and better. Because if you're inking, especially like comics, you have to ink like every kind of material and reflective surface, and you're going to be doing it by feel, and then you're going to, unless you're just applying, a strict set of rules that someone taught you, but I don't know how realistic that is, because you do need to have an understanding of the world. You can't, the rules are not going to be able to capture the complexity of what you're going to have to capture if you're doing a comic with a world. that actually has a world. And some don't, in a way. But yeah, you're going to have to reflect on what you're doing, and you're going to learn what worked and what didn't. And then get better at it. But you never stop doing it in the organic way. You never stop feeling those surfaces, feeling how they should be. And then, by feel of the environment, by the material you're inking, but also by feel of what's going to look good, what's going to, what follows good principles. So here, Sun in his grass cloak, I've added a lot of lines and weight to the cloak on the left, but I left it open on the right. Because I knew that if I fill that in all the way to the right, it's going to start to blend with Farah's silhouette. And I want to keep those separated. So I knew to stop the lines. So it's not simply by the material, but you're kind of two-brained about it. You're paying attention to the world, but you're paying attention to the drawing, the how to make it look good. And yeah, this was nice. This was the most complicated backgrounds I've probably had to do. The most complicated scenes I've had to do yet in this comic. I've done it in other comics before, but this is also the first time I've done it without thumbnailing on separate paper to work it out. I'm just doing it on the page, which I've done for this comic, but I haven't done this level of complexity and backgrounds in that fashion, I don't think. And it's working. I'm comfortable with this. I would love for it to look better, and someday it will. But for now, it's working. I'm conveying a pretty complicated world very freely, pretty quickly. It takes longer than some pages do, but it's done in the same fashion, in the same approach. You'll see when I'm inking, I'm adding the straw texture. I'm adding that bit by bit. I didn't finish drawing the outline of the cart because I knew that the straw would overlap it. So after I did the line on the left, I was like, oh wait, I need to let some of the straw be above the cart. So I better not finish the cart's drawing yet. So that's why I'm moving around the image somewhat. And now I come back to the cart and I finish the cart once I know that the straw's on top. And you do that without thinking. It's just habit. Procedural memory. I just did my first watercolor, I guess. Sort of watercolored ink drawing for the pin click, which would be the 21st. And we're going to be doing an episode after Frazetta, so drawing from inspiration or in the style of Frazetta. And we're going to have some guests like Kyle Strom of Twig. So excited to see what he whips up with us. And I went in the spirit of Frazetta, trying to do it in one day, which I did. Doing it in one day, and trying to capture the physical, muscular, big action scene with lots of figures in a nice triangle composition, And I didn't know what I was doing. It's a play project, so I'm playing with. I did pencils, and then I did some ink wash, and then I thought, well, I should go ahead and do some watercolor, even though this is a Bristol board and not the best paper for it. So I do the watercolor. And then it's time to ink it, but I actually no longer have decent brushes to ink with a brush. So I had to use the nib, which definitely changed things. But it turned out pretty cool. So I'll share that on here after the episode airs. And I actually recorded the whole process of doing that. So I'll make a video of that. I don't know if it'll be draw process or something else, but I'll share that in a video. And here is this finished page. Just erased the pencils out from under it. Just a little bit of whiteout to clean up a few things. I no longer worry about lines falling outside of the panel border because it's easy to erase digitally. So I typically let my panel borders be drawn over the gutters and anything fall into the gutters. And and I don't know, someday I might incorporate some ink wash or some watercolor. I may watercolor these comic pages. That would be interesting. Not these, but in a future comic. But I know for me, spending, I don't even know how long that was, but maybe 8 hours on one illustration, I don't like it. And I heard that Frazetta didn't either. He mentioned the goofy cartoons is more what he's like, and the paintings were labor as a work. But yeah, I don't want to do those long pieces like that very often. Maybe if money's involved, that'd be different. But making comics is definitely where I'm at. And there's skills that I build doing this that I get to show off when I do, like a painting. Like there's hidden skill in a lot of cartoonists. Anyways, that's it for this week. I hope you got something out of this. Over on the Clever Kaiju Discord, we have classes for comic illustration. At least we just are wrapping one up. And sometimes we do meetings where we educate and discuss things. So I'll be on that Discord every now and then, sharing and maybe teaching something. So if you're a comic artist, you might want to check that out. See you next week.